Hey guys, tonight we step into a battlefield, not the shiny, polished version from your favourite fantasy show, but the grim, noisy and utterly exhausting real deal. You're standing encased in layers of metal and leather, a night's dream transformed into a reality check you might regret very soon. You hear the distant cries of men, the muffled clang of weapons, and feel the weight of your armour pressing down, already bruising your shoulders. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. Not comfortably anyway. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 a.m? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless Sleep. The air is thick with dust, stirred up by 100 shuffling feet. You take your first steps toward battle, and immediately reality sets in. Forget graceful leaps and heroic lunges, you clank, creak and wobble. Your metal boots sink awkwardly into mud, the sticky earth gripping them like jealous hands determined to slow you down. Each step demands Herculean effort, but you soldier on because retreating now would make for an embarrassingly short nightly career. Armour, you quickly discover, is less a sleek suit of impenetrable metal and more a cocoon of constant discomfort. Sure, it looks impressive from afar, glistening in the midday sun, reflecting beams of heroism, but inside you're anything but comfortable. Your shoulders ache, burdened by steel pauldrons that felt manageable earlier when adrenaline still masked your exhaustion. The thick padding beneath your breastplate, meant to prevent bruises, now traps heat against your body like an oven mitt on Thanksgiving morning. You feel the chill of sweat trickle down your spine, collecting at your waistband in an uncomfortable pool. Forget dry cleaning. Medieval knights had to endure clammy layers beneath metal plates all day. If you think wearing a heavy winter coat indoors is bad, try hauling 60 pounds of steel into a skirmish that might stretch into hours. Now add to that the sheer mental strain of keeping your courage high and your spirit fierce. Yeah, suddenly that clanging suit feels less noble and more like medieval punishment. But it's not just the heaviness or the heat, it's the noise. The relentless, jarring soundtrack that comes with armour. With every move, metal scrapes against metal, like the world's worst orchestra tuning up forever. Each breath you take reverberates within your steel helmet, creating an eerie echo that makes even simple sighs sound dramatic. You're a one-night percussion ensemble, and your conductor seems hell-bent on exhausting you before you even swing your sword. Around you, your comrades trudge forward, their own rhythmic clatter joining yours. Each armoured warrior is a noisy, sweaty, grumbling symphony, an unintended chorus of battle-weary discomfort. You share knowing glances through slits in your helmets, camaraderie born from mutual misery. But still, beneath those visors you see determination, because despite the torment, each knight believed armour was their best bet for survival. Historians still debate whether armour truly made the difference between life and death on medieval battlefields. Some argue that it provided vital protection, turning aside blows and absorbing strikes that would otherwise end a knight's career abruptly and permanently. Others suggest it simply prolonged the inevitable, leaving knights exhausted and vulnerable when stamina finally gave out. But regardless of scholarly debates, one fact remains clear. Knights wore their armour as proudly as modern-day heroes wear uniforms, accepting discomfort as the price of honour. And speaking of pride, there was plenty of it in armour craftsmanship. Armourers spent weeks, months, sometimes even years perfecting their craft, creating suits tailored specifically to their wearers. Each piece was custom-fitted, painstakingly adjusted, and lovingly polished until it gleamed. But despite meticulous fittings, armour still pinched and pressed awkwardly. It refused to conform entirely, reminding you constantly that while humans crafted armour, humans were never meant to wear it comfortably. There's even a quirky tidbit about medieval knights obsessively personalising their armour, not just with family crests or symbols of their heraldry, but with humorous and often surprisingly cheeky engravings. Historians have discovered suits bearing hidden jokes and sarcastic mottos, proof that knights knew exactly how ridiculous their battle attire could feel, and chose humour to make their discomfort bearable. Imagine standing knee-deep in mud, heart hammering in your chest, while your armour proudly proclaims, "Better sweating than bleeding," or "My smith hates me." But now humour offers only temporary relief, a fleeting distraction from the painful reality gripping you tighter with each heavy step forward. The sweat pools again, trickling down your temples, dripping beneath your helmet into eyes already stinging from grit and dust. Blinking furiously, you try desperately to keep your vision clear, aware that clarity could mean the difference between dodging a blade or suffering a painful reminder that your armour wasn't always foolproof. And let's not forget, your steel armour isn't just uncomfortable, it's also shockingly inflexible. With every movement you rediscover your limitations. Lifting your arms above your shoulders feels nearly impossible, like trying to perform yoga poses while wrapped tightly in aluminum foil. Turning your head fully to assess threats behind you is a distant dream. Instead, you pivot your whole body awkwardly, looking less like a heroic knight and more like a confused metallic penguin. Still you march onward, propelled by duty or pride or sheer stubbornness. You think about the knights before you who trudged into battle, armoured in cumbersome metal, weighed down by expectations as heavy as their suits. Generations of warriors who faced discomfort not as an inconvenience, but as a badge of honour, one you now share, begrudgingly perhaps, but proudly too. Finally you halt briefly, catching your breath beneath the stifling steel helmet. Ahead you see enemy soldiers, some similarly armoured, others lightly clad, readying themselves. Your armour suddenly feels less like a nuisance and more like a lifeline. Beneath layers of metal, sweat-soaked padding and mounting exhaustion, you steel yourself, quite literally, realising your survival might indeed depend on this oppressive cocoon. But that realisation doesn't erase the aches or soften the pinch of armour plates digging into your hips. Taking a deep breath, you prepare to charge, knowing that the brutal discomfort is only about to intensify. Armour is your ally, your tormentor, and your protector, all wrapped into one heavy package. And as you surge forward, every fibre of your being protesting, you wonder fleetingly if the blacksmith who forged your armour ever imagined how uncomfortable you'd feel charging into battle. Probably not. But then again, knights rarely complained out loud. They wore their discomfort stoically, silently accepting armour's brutal embrace as simply part of the job. And tonight, safely tucked away from medieval battlefields, perhaps your own discomfort fades too, softened by stories of warriors enduring far worse. If knights could march onward through such suffocating discomfort, perhaps our modern-day annoyances seem just a little less daunting. So, let the distant echoes of metal armour clanging gently lull you into dreams, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing we do is bear our burdens quietly, knowing comfort awaits just beyond the struggle. You stagger onward, and already your lungs are complaining. For all the romantic notions of knights thundering across fields in shining steel, there's one inconvenient fact the ballads usually skip. Breathing inside armour is a nightmare worthy of its own medieval torture manual. Air is precious, and the longer you spend inside this metallic cocoon, the more you realise how each breath is a battle of its own. Your helmet, custom-fitted, supposedly engineered for both safety and comfort, wraps your head in darkness and clangour. The air inside quickly becomes warm and stale, tinged with the bitter tang of sweat and old leather. Most medieval helmets, from the classic great helm to the later visored bassinet, left only narrow slits or tiny holes for airflow. Try covering your nose and mouth with a saucepan and see how long you last before you start thinking about all the air outside that you can't have. You inhale and the inside of the helmet steams up just a little, making each breath feel thicker, heavier, less satisfying. If you've ever had to breathe through a mask on a hot day, you know a fraction of the sensation. Multiply that by 10, then imagine the world is also screaming around you. Knights weren't oblivious to this problem. In fact, helmet breath was such a common complaint that Smith sometimes added a few more holes or a slightly wider slit, though not enough to compromise protection. But there's a balance. Too many holes, and a blade or arrow might find its way through. Too few, and you risk blacking out before the enemy even gets close. Historians still argue whether knights more often succumb to enemy swords or their own lack of oxygen. Imagine that post-battle interview. "Sir Geoffrey, how did you lose consciousness?" "Oh, overzealous helmet design." Then there was the constant sound of your own breath. Every inhale and exhale echoed inside the steel chamber, amplifying the noise until you felt like Darth Vader's anxious ancestor. The outside world became muffled, replaced by the symphony of your ragged breathing, the thud of your heart, and the occasional drip of sweat hitting metal. If your nose started to run or you coughed, congratulations. Now you're living in your own personal echo chamber with no mute button. And let's be honest, wiping your nose inside a helmet. Best not to think too hard about the medieval hygiene situation. At the height of battle, when adrenaline pumped and every sense screamed for clarity, breathing became even more difficult. Panting after a long run? Now imagine doing it through a metal filter. A sweat pours down your face and your helmet's airflow is little more than wishful thinking. More than one knight, overcome by heat and exertion, slumped behind the lines, simply unable to catch his breath. If you've ever felt lightheaded in a crowded elevator, multiply that by the terror of a battlefield and you'll start to understand. There's a mainstream historical fact that's both comforting and comical. Knights occasionally passed out from lack of air or overheating, and their squires would rush in to yank off their helmets before they suffocated. It was a real known risk. Some chroniclers even tell stories of knights fainting dramatically mid-battle, only to be revived by a burst of fresh air and a slap from a concerned and possibly annoyed squire. You can almost picture the squire muttering, "Sir, not again, please drink some water next time." But even in the thick of discomfort, some knights made the best of it. There's a quirky detail from the margins of history. Certain nobles would tuck sweet-smelling herbs or flowers into the lining of their helmets, hoping the scent would mask the stink of sweat and fear, and maybe, just maybe, make the air feel fresher. Lavender, rosemary, and even garlic were popular choices. Imagine trying to look intimidating while secretly inhaling lavender like an anxious Victorian grandmother. In a strange way, these tiny comforts humanize the armoured giants of history, reminding us that, beneath the metal, they were as desperate for a little relief as anyone stuck in Monday morning traffic. And let's not forget the realities of sickness. Imagine catching a cold or, heaven forbid, coming down with the flu. Sneezing in a steel helmet isn't just inconvenient, it's a recipe for utter misery. There's a vivid tale from a 15th century chronicle describing a knight who, in the middle of a tournament, sneezed so violently that his visor flew up and he was momentarily blinded by his own snot. The crowd laughed. The poor knight did not. Historians are still divided on just how much ventilation mattered. Some argue that the fear of suffocation is overblown, that armour was well ventilated enough, at least in cooler climates or during brief engagements. Others point out the countless records of knights overheating, passing out, or simply tearing off their helmets in frustration, even at the risk of catching an arrow between the eyes. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. Some knights tolerated it better than others, and everyone secretly wished for a little more fresh air. But on those particularly grueling days when the sun blazed high and the battle seemed endless, the helmet's embrace became intolerable. Your breath grew shallow and rapid. Your face, pressed against the padded liner, itched with sweat. Sometimes you'd catch yourself panicking, fighting the irrational urge to claw at your helmet, desperate for a single lungful of cool, clean air. Of all the reasons to envy a lightly armoured foot soldier, this was perhaps the most compelling. Let's pause for a moment and imagine. It's early afternoon. The air is heavy with the scent of grass and blood, and the only thing between you and fresh air is half an inch of carefully forged steel. You try to ignore the sensation, focus on your breathing, count the seconds between each inhale, each exhale, trying to create a rhythm, a steady heartbeat to drown out the panic. For a while, it works, but then the battle rages anew, and you're thrust back into the chaos, lungs burning, helmet fogging, air growing ever more precious. Occasionally you might spot a commander with his visor up, gasping like a fish out of water in those rare moments of safety, desperate to cool off before plunging back into danger. That brief moment, lifting the visor, gulping down the breeze, became a treasured ritual. If you were lucky, the air tasted sweet, touched with the faint promise of rain. If not, it was thick with smoke, sweat, and fear. All this might sound a bit overdramatic, but try remembering the last time you felt truly winded, maybe after running up too many stairs or wearing a mask on a humid day. Now imagine being unable to take it off, surrounded by chaos, expected to fight for your life. You might start to feel a little more sympathy for the knights of old. Every time you turn your head, the world narrows. Your breath rattles in your ears, and you feel the pressure growing, like a lid screwed tight. Yet, for all the misery, you push onward. Because the alternative, removing your helmet, exposing yourself to danger, is simply not an option. And so, you learn to cope. You take shallower breaths. You shift your helmet on your brow, hoping to find a better angle. Sometimes, in rare moments of respite, you close your eyes and focus only on the sound of your own breathing, letting it anchor you amidst the madness. A modern joke. If medieval knights had Fitbits, most of their steps would be panic lunges and helmet gasps. And if you think the Apple Watch nagging you to stand up every hour is bad, imagine it vibrating every time you nearly passed out. Some sources even mention clever little breath holes punched by knights themselves after a few particularly unpleasant battles, risking their armour's structural integrity just for a few more precious wisps of air. Call it medieval customization, or just a desperate attempt to avoid suffocation. Either way, the urge to breathe freely often trumped the best-laid plans of armourers. It's a vivid contradiction, isn't it? The armour meant to save your life could just as easily make you feel like you're losing it, breath by breath. Yet, you and your fellow knights persist. Part stubbornness, part tradition, part hope that if you can just make it through this skirmish, you'll have one more story to tell by the fire. As the day stretches on, your breaths become shallow and ragged. You notice your companions, some stoic, some visibly struggling, a few discreetly raising their visors whenever they dare. The battle rages, and every breath inside your helmet feels like a tiny victory against the suffocating steel. And when, finally, the clash subsides, the first thing every knight does, before even checking for wounds, is to rip off that helmet and gulp down the world's most delicious, most ordinary air. In that moment, the world feels wide and open, and you remember what you've been fighting for. Not just glory or survival, but the simple, blessed act of breathing free. The sun is barely past its peak, but you wouldn't know it inside your personal furnace. The sky is a white glare overhead, and each step forward feels like you're walking deeper into the core of the sun. The polished metal of your armour catches the light and reflects it inward, turning every plate, every rivet, every joint into a tiny, radiant stove. The padding beneath, which once felt like gentle cushioning, is now saturated with sweat, clinging to your skin like a wet wool blanket. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. You are overheating, your skin tingles, your vision swims, and you realise that, inside this medieval steel trap, you're not battling just your enemies, you're fighting your own body. Medieval armour was made for protection, not comfort. The makers, expert blacksmiths and armourers, crafted plate armour to deflect arrows, sword swings, even blunt trauma. But what they couldn't deflect was the sun, and in summer, during the countless battles fought across the warm valleys of France, the dusty roads of Spain, or the scorched hillsides of the Holy Land, A suit of armour didn't just cook you, it slow roasted you alive. In fact, there's a mainstream historical fact that makes this all worse. Most medieval battles happened during spring and summer, not because soldiers were sun worshippers, but because winter roads were too muddy and food supplies were unreliable in cold months. So naturally you'd be fully suited in gleaming armour during the hottest time of year, marching under the noon sun, surrounded by hundreds of equally sweaty men, all of you stewing inside steel cans like regret-flavoured soup. And yes, you sweat. A lot. You sweat from your scalp under your armpits, down your back, through your boots. The inside of your armour becomes a humid ecosystem of its own, damp and rank. The linen undershirt soaks through, the arming doublet becomes spongy, and your padded chausses start to chafe in unspeakable places. Each layer of soaked fabric presses against the skin beneath your cuirass, and let's not even talk about what happens to your socks. If you're imagining a medieval knight as clean and noble, brace yourself. You smell awful. Everyone smells awful. You reek of iron and old sweat, horsehair and mouldy cloth, and possibly a hint of yesterday's dried stew. And here's the thing, there's no escape from it. You can't lift your arms enough to fan yourself. You can't wipe the sweat from your brow because your visor's in the way. You can't even properly scratch your nose. It was so bad that knights developed tricks to cope. Some filled their helmets with herbs like rosemary or sage, hoping to mask the odour and ease their nausea. Others soaked their underlayers in vinegar or wine before marching, because at least that smell was familiar. Some even packed snow or wet cloth between their layers on cooler mornings, praying the moisture would last past breakfast. Spoiler, it didn't. And if you're wondering about hydration, oh dear listener, you'd better sit down. Medieval knights did not have insulated water bottles clipped to their belts. They had leather flasks maybe, or wineskins, but there was no standardised way to hydrate on the battlefield. Water was often lukewarm, sometimes muddy, occasionally suspect. You drink whatever you could find before battle. Ale, watered-down wine, stale water, and then sweat it all out within the first hour of marching. By mid-afternoon, you're dehydrated. You feel dizzy. You can't think clearly. Heat stroke isn't a modern concern. It was a medieval death sentence in disguise. Historians still argue whether more men fell from swords or sunstroke. Chronicles mention knights collapsing mid-charge or staggering into the shade, too weak to lift their swords. There's a famous account of the Battle of Agincourt where several French knights suffocated or passed out in their own armour before even reaching the English lines. Less due to arrows, more from exhaustion and heat. And don't think lighter armour solved the problem. Even chainmail, called hauberk, trapped heat like a grill cover. Worn over padded gambesons, mail didn't breathe. It hugged your body, shifting only slightly, absorbing the sun and radiating it back at you like a personal solar oven. Your body didn't care whether it was plate or mail, hot was hot, and your internal thermometer was already screaming. But for many nights the worst part wasn't the heat itself, it was the silence about it. Complaining was a luxury of the unarmoured. Grumbling about heat made you look weak. So instead, men suffered in silence, cheeks flushed, lips cracked, eyes wild with fatigue. They vomited behind trees, they fainted on their horses, they fought with blurred vision and pounding skulls, all while trying to maintain dignity and poise beneath a helmet that smelled like sour soup. In one particularly grim example, a knight at the Siege of Acre in 1191 was recorded to have fainted inside his armour, fallen face first into a latrine trench, and drowned before anyone could pull him out. A terrible way to go, and a perfect medieval metaphor for overheating in battle. Death by heat, shame, and poor planning. And still, the armour stayed on. Because what choice did you have? Take it off, and you're vulnerable. Stay in it, and you slowly become soup. Every choice was bad. It's the kind of situation that makes you appreciate breathable fabrics. And maybe your air conditioner a little more. There's a quirky tidbit here that makes things even more ridiculous. During tournaments, which were supposed to be safe practice fights, nobles would wear extra decoration. Plumes, flourishes, painted crests on top of their already stifling armour. These fancy additions made airflow even worse, but image was everything. Imagine fainting from heat stroke because your feathers were too fabulous. That's medieval priorities for you, and yes, your helmet's shape mattered too. The infamous frog-mouth helm, designed to deflect sword tips, was especially terrible for airflow. It left almost no room for breathing and zero peripheral vision. Wearing one during a long joust in July? You might as well ask to be grilled. Now let's imagine you've survived a full day in the heat. Your armour is soaked through. Your hands are blistered. Your armpits feel like a battlefield of their own. When you finally dismount and peel off your gauntlets, you realise your fingertips are shriveled like prunes. The metal has chafed your skin raw. You might even have steam rising off your body as cooler evening air hits your damp tunic. Removing the rest of your armour is an ordeal. You need help. Your squire wrestles with the buckles, the straps, the laces. It takes nearly an hour. By the time you're finally free, you slump against a tree and breathe like you've just resurfaced from underwater. Your body aches. Your head throbs. You sip from a skin of water and thank every saint you can think of that you didn't pass out somewhere in the middle of a battlefield. It's humbling, really. You trained for years. You memorize battlefield strategy. You pray. You plan. But sometimes your greatest enemy isn't a sword. It's the summer sun. And yet the armour goes back on the next day, because the threat of arrows, blades and blunt force trauma always outweighs the discomfort of heat stroke. Mostly. Kind of. In our modern minds, knights live as symbols of bravery, strength, and stoic endurance. But perhaps their greatest act of heroism wasn't winning wars, it was not passing out halfway through them. They endured the heat, the stink, the fatigue, and the mental fog just for the slimmest chance of surviving another clash. That is resilience. That is pain. That is medieval armour. So the next time you complain about a hot day at the office or a crowded subway, remember the poor soul sweating bullets inside 60 pounds of steel, with no fan, no breathable fabrics, and no escape until sunset. At least you're not being roasted alive in a historical fashion statement. You're mid-charge now, or at least something that vaguely resembles charging. In your mind, charging probably involves heroic leaps, agile sidesteps, and lightning-quick dodges. But in armour, your charge looks more like a hurried stumble combined with the desperate waddle of someone who just realised they left the stove on back home. Moving in armour was, to put it mildly, awkward. It was the opposite of graceful, dignified, or athletic. Every plate strapped to your body was a new impediment, a fresh obstacle to basic mobility. Sure, armour was articulated, carefully hinged and jointed to allow movement. But no matter how cleverly designed, your body still moved stiffly, forced to adapt to the limitations of metal encasement. And it wasn't just heavy, armour was incredibly restrictive. Consider trying to scratch your back when fully armoured. Spoiler alert, it's impossible. If a bug crawled down your back during a battle, you'd simply have to make peace with the fact it was now your companion until sundown. Imagine trying to bend down to pick up a dropped sword. Simple enough, right? Well, in armour, bending at the waist wasn't just tricky, it was borderline comedic. Knights didn't casually bend, they awkwardly crouched, hoping their knee joints wouldn't lock up mid-motion. You'd see knights doing this odd half-squat, half-lunge to retrieve fallen weapons or helmets, often aided by a squire running to their rescue, red-faced and struggling not to laugh. And let's not even talk about running. In movies, armoured knights sprint heroically across battlefields, swords flashing dramatically. In reality, knights couldn't truly run, not the way you picture running. They shuffled hurriedly, at best managing a determined jog punctuated by clangs and desperate grunts. Each step rattled their armour loudly, and their breathing turned into a desperate wheeze. So here you are, stumbling along, trying not to trip over uneven ground. Every bump, every rock, every slippery patch of mud beneath your metal boots threatens to topple you like a heavily armoured turtle. And yes, falling in armour was exactly as humiliating as it sounds. Once down, standing up again required the grace of a gymnast combined with the strength of a powerlifter, or, more realistically, a few exasperated comrades dragging you upright, grumbling about your clumsiness. Historians love arguing about how flexible armour truly was. Some insist that a well-made suit allowed impressive freedom of motion. Others laugh at this idea, pointing out numerous historical accounts of knights tripping, tumbling, and generally embarrassing themselves in full view of amused allies and enemies alike. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere between these extremes. Armour did allow movement, but calling it free movement was about as accurate as calling a medieval latrine a luxury spub. A quirky historical tidbit to make you smile or cringe. Tournaments sometimes featured agility tests designed specifically to humiliate knights. One particularly infamous game involved knights climbing ladders, crawling through low tunnels and even attempting to cross narrow balance beams, all while fully armoured. Imagine the laughter from the watching crowds as these noble warriors stumbled, slipped and collapsed, helmets ringing like church bells. Nothing shatters heroic mystique faster than watching a knight belly flop onto soft grass, unable to get up, arms and legs flailing like a metallic beetle. It's hard enough moving forward, but turning around. That was another ordeal altogether. Armour severely limited your torso rotation. To look behind you, you had to awkwardly rotate your entire body, shifting your feet and twisting your hips slowly, painfully, as if performing the world's least appealing dance. Forget quick glances over your shoulder. Every backward look was a careful, laborious manoeuvre. Armoured combat manuals from the late medieval period reveal the clever techniques knights developed to overcome mobility issues. They emphasise moves designed specifically around armour's limitations. Short thrusts instead of wide swings, careful pivots instead of sudden twists, and tiny shuffles instead of big strides. Armour didn't just affect how knights moved, it fundamentally reshaped combat itself. And the hands? Gauntlets protected your fingers, sure, but they also severely limited dexterity. You might grip your sword, lance or mace tightly enough, but anything requiring finesse was out of the question. Adjusting straps mid-battle? Good luck. Drawing a dagger from its sheath quickly? Maybe, but probably not without some frantic fumbling. Knights often trained obsessively just to perform basic tasks smoothly in armour, knowing full well the battlefield wasn't forgiving of butterfingered fumbling. Climbing onto a horse in armour deserves special mention. Modern films depict knights effortlessly swinging into saddles, armour gleaming heroically. Reality was less elegant. Getting onto a horse while armoured was a cumbersome, exhausting process, often requiring a mounting block or the help of several squires pushing from below. Historical documents recount numerous embarrassing incidents involving knights slipping halfway up, tumbling backward, and landing heavily on their armoured backsides, dignity bruised far worse than their bodies. Even when safely mounted, manoeuvring the horse required constant vigilance. Your balance was precarious, your movements limited, and your horse, burdened by your weight and equipment, moved slower, clumsier than usual. Guiding your steed while encased in steel was an exercise in patience, coordination, and frequent muttered prayers to whichever saint specialised in equestrian disasters. So why bother? Why endure all this clunky awkwardness? Well, simply put, armour kept you alive. If the price of survival was looking foolish or clumsy, knights paid it willingly, most of the time. But even the bravest knight probably had private moments, adjusting yet another uncomfortable buckle, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it would be better to risk injury than spend another day stumbling around in metal pyjamas. There's a poignant medieval record about the aftermath of battle. Knights recounting exhaustion not from fighting, but from the sheer physical effort of wearing armour. Men complained bitterly about aching backs, swollen knees, stiff shoulders and bruised hips. They groaned, joked darkly, and exchanged sympathetic nods, fully aware that armour's protection came at a steep, painful cost. On particularly muddy days, knights' boots would stick so firmly in the earth that they'd have to pull their feet free with exaggerated effort, occasionally leaving boots behind in the mud. prompting frustrated knights to hobble barefoot in steel greaves across slippery terrain, cursing armourers, mud, and their questionable life choices. In a sense, armoured knights were prisoners of their own protection, trapped inside metal suits, longing for simpler, freer movement. It's a strange paradox. Armour that saved your life could also be the very thing that endangered it, limiting your reactions, dulling your agility, and making every step treacherous. Historians still debate the precise impact of armour's limitations on historical battles. Some argue the increased protection outweighed mobility issues. Others insist armour sometimes hindered knights more than it helped. The ongoing scholarly bickering probably wouldn't amuse knights themselves, who knew intimately the exhaustion and frustration of each encumbered step. If armour had a slogan, it might be something along the lines of "Guaranteed survival, if you never have to run, jump, climb, or turn quickly." Knights accepted this grim bargain, marching slowly into danger, knowing their survival depended as much on luck as it did on steel. But in moments of quiet reflection, knights surely questioned the trade-offs. Was the safety armour provided worth sacrificing freedom of movement? Was surviving a battle worth the daily indignity of waddling awkwardly, stumbling on uneven ground, or needing 3 friends just to mount a horse? In medieval warfare, these questions had no easy answers. Armour offered life, but it also stole mobility. Knights lived, and sometimes died, within that uncomfortable compromise. They adapted, invented coping strategies, and occasionally grumbled privately about their clumsy fate, fully aware their noble image depended heavily on nobody noticing just how awkward they really were. And perhaps, as you drift gently towards sleep tonight, you can find a quiet solidarity with those knights of old, recognizing that everyone, from ancient heroes to modern-day dreamers, carries burdens that limit, frustrate, and challenge them. And yet, despite those burdens, we keep moving forward, clumsy steps and all, hoping our awkward efforts bring us closer to safety, understanding, and peace. Now let's get painfully honest about armour's dark secret. It didn't just weigh you down or slow you up, it tortured you with every step. Forget the dream of galloping into glory. For most armoured warriors, the real battle was happening right under their steel shell. Chafing, pinching, bruising, and outright agony were constant companions. Even before swords clashed, your worst enemy might just be your own ill-fitted suit. You'd think for the price of a decent manor, a knight could buy comfort along with safety. But even the finest custom-fitted armour had its quirks. If you were lucky, and rich, a skilled armourer spent weeks measuring and hammering, fitting your plates and chainmail just for your frame. Still, metal is metal, and humans come in all shapes, and medieval tailors weren't exactly running focus groups for ergonomic design, so you put it on. That moment of donning armour, which might look majestic in a tapestry, is actually a group effort, and rarely elegant. First comes the padded linen or woolen arming doublet, a thick quilted layer meant to cushion your body. Already it's hot and restrictive. Then the chainmail shirt, which weighs like a sack of wet laundry and rubs your collarbones raw before you even get to the steel. Next come the breastplate and backplate. Your folds to guard the hips, tassets over the thighs, and on it goes. Each piece, no matter how carefully crafted, finds some clever way to dig into your softest spots. And then, just as you think you're done, the straps. Leather, often stiff and unyielding, pull the armour plates tight. Buckles press against bones, rivets poke and prod. The arming points, those little laces that tie pieces together, dig into your skin. Every adjustment brings new aches. Stand up and you feel the whole rig pinch your armpits, squeeze your shoulders, and compress your chest. You twist for a test swing. Now the elbow cop bites into your joint, or the inside of your thigh gets a surprise pinch. Medieval letters and chroniclers loved to joke about the secret sorrows of the knight. One 14th century Frenchman described his first day in plate as like wrestling with angry ferrets. Each plate seeks to find a new wound. Another squire moaned, "By noon my thighs were bruised and my pride gone. both thanks to my lord's old mail shirt. You have to laugh, or you'll cry, and sometimes you'll do both. It wasn't just bruising. Poorly fitted or borrowed armour was worse. Imagine rushing to battle, borrowing another man's suit. The joints don't line up. Your knees get crushed every time you step. The helmet spins around, blocking your view. Your gauntlets are so loose you can barely grip your sword, or so tight they cut off your blood flow. Try to adjust them in the field and risk missing the fight, or worse, losing a finger to clumsy haste. And yet, the cost of perfect armour was astronomical. The average knight might never own a full set built for his body alone. Most made do, patching old bits, inheriting family suits, or buying off the rack at the local armourer, then praying for the best. The result? Chafed armpits, raw necks, blistered feet, and bruised hips. Some even stuffed rags and moss under plates to cushion the pain, but this only worked until the next rainstorm or hard march. Wounds from armour itself were so common that some armies employed armour surgeons. These weren't full doctors, but specialists at patching up bruises, blisters, and raw skin. A knight might emerge from battle without a scratch from enemy blades, yet sport a colourful array of bruises shaped suspiciously, like the buckles and studs on his breastplate. Imagine explaining those bruises at home. No, dear, I wasn't struck by a lance. I was just squeezed by my own shirt. And then there's chafing, the infamous enemy of thighs and armpits everywhere, even with padding, sweat-soaked, cloth-rubbed skin raw in hours. After a day's march or a tournament, a knight could sport wounds so painful he'd limp for days. Chroniclers tell us of knights applying herbal salves, bandaging themselves like mummies, or even refusing to get armoured again until their wounds healed. Some reportedly stuffed wool, moss, or soft leaves into their boots and under their armour, hoping for relief. Historians still argue about how common these injuries really were. Some insist the best armourers, German, Italian, English, could make a suit as comfortable as any heavy coat, provided you had the coin. Others, citing the sheer volume of complaints, believe that pain was as much a part of knightly life as courage or chivalry. Maybe the real answer is simple. For every lucky noble with perfect gear, there were 10 less fortunate knights soldiering on in makeshift rigs that pinched and punished at every step. Sometimes the pain went further than mere bruises. Armour could cause real and lasting injury, nerve compression in the arms or legs, circulation issues, chronic joint pain. These were all occupational hazards. There are even accounts of knights permanently losing sensation in their fingers or toes, their limbs going numb after years of pinched nerves. And yet the pain was considered a mark of honour. "If you do not bear the scars of your harness, you have never truly fought," wrote one French knight. In other words, discomfort was the price of belonging to the warrior elite. Still, even the toughest knight craved comfort. Armourers tried over the centuries to improve their designs. Softer linings, better articulation, wider straps, all slowly helped, yet never fully solved, the problem. As with most things medieval, change was slow, and most advances went only to the wealthy or famous. And here's a little-known but mainstream fact. Some of the greatest knights, the true celebrities of their day, died not in glorious combat, but from infections caused by blisters and wounds under their armour. A simple cut or chafed patch left untreated could turn deadly in a world before antibiotics. Armour was protection against swords, not bacteria. There are written debates between armourers and knights, letters full of complaints about pinching elbows or stinging backs, countered by long-winded explanations about why the design couldn't be changed. If we make the elbow wider, you'll catch a blade. If we pad the hip, you'll fall when you run. Both sides were right, and both sides suffered. Some knights, desperate, ordered improvements that made things worse. Extra buckles, odd padding, bizarre metal flanges that only added new points of pain. No two bodies were the same, and after a day in battle every knight's body ached in its own special way. You learned to live with it, to walk with a hitch, to massage your neck before and after a long march, to avoid sleeping on your bruised side. The aches became part of you, like a limp or an old scar, not always visible but ever present. And that was the brutal trade. Armour kept you alive but demanded suffering in return. The code of chivalry demanded courage and sacrifice, but it forgot to mention that sometimes the most constant wearing battle was not against your enemies but your own mail and plate. So tonight, if you find yourself shifting in bed, frustrated by a wrinkle in your sheets or a tag scratching at your neck, take comfort. Even the mightiest knights, encased in steel, were plagued by small, relentless discomforts, reminders that protection and pain often walk hand in hand. You've survived the worst, a day of clanking, stumbling, sweating, and the painful squeeze of steel against flesh. You ache from helmet to heel, and now nature calls. And here's the medieval dilemma that no knight, no matter how noble, could ignore. There are no bathroom breaks on the battlefield. In full armour, answering the call of nature isn't just awkward, it's a logistical nightmare and the stuff of every squire's worst day. Let's be honest, no Hollywood movie dares show this. The storybooks never describe the moment when the mighty champion, proud and dignified, suddenly feels his guts twist in the middle of a long siege or a never-ending battle. But out there, under the sweltering sun or cold rain, the reality of armour made simple human needs anything but simple. You wake up before dawn, already feeling the weight of anticipation, and 60 pounds of metal. Maybe you gulp down some watery ale for courage. You think you're prepared for the day's dangers, but then, halfway through the march, or just as your captain shouts the order to charge, your stomach gurgles a warning. All at once you realise there's no escape. The battlefield doesn't pause for anyone, not even a knight in shining armour. The first challenge is obvious. Full plate armour is a fortress. Plates protect your chest, your back, your thighs, your knees, your shins. A skirt of folds and tassets guards your groin and upper legs. Underneath, a thickly padded gambeson hugs your body, itself laced and buckled to keep everything snug. Even the simplest act, like scratching your ankle, is nearly impossible. Relieving yourself, that's a whole new level of trouble. If you're lucky, you're somewhere behind the lines, far enough from the chaos to attempt a solution. Maybe your squire is nearby, a young boy or adolescent, possibly more terrified of your bodily functions than of the enemy. Removing armour isn't quick. It can take 15 minutes just to unbuckle, untie, and peel away the layers below your belt. If there's a latrine, it's usually nothing more than a pit or a bush. If not, you improvise, praying for privacy and speed. There are historical records that make this awkward truth clear. Medieval chroniclers didn't dwell on it, but they didn't hide it either. Some knights confessed that the mere thought of having to go during a battle made them more anxious than the thought of arrows or swords. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was the risk of being caught, exposed, or helpless at exactly the wrong moment. But what about in the thick of combat? Here's the cold, hard, soggy fact. You simply couldn't get your armour off fast enough. If your body insisted, you did what you had to do, right then and there. In the heat of battle or in a long siege, knights, men-at-arms and common soldiers all suffered the same fate. Armour became a mobile privy. Once the need struck, you had no choice but to go in your armour and hope to deal with the aftermath later. Some knights tried to plan ahead, avoiding food or drink before battle, but the unpredictability of war and human biology often ruined the best-laid plans. In siege warfare, where armour was worn for days at a time, the situation was even grimmer. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War describe men forced to camp in their armour for days, forced to sleep, eat, and relieve themselves without ever truly undressing. If the stench didn't drive you mad, the shame just might. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. At least one 15th century manual written for the young noblemen learning the knightly arts actually suggested that warriors eat plenty of dried fruit before donning armour, claiming it bound the humours and reduced accidents. The same manual cautioned against ale brewed with new oats, which apparently had the opposite effect. Imagine planning your diet based on how hard it'll be to remove your pants. But the discomfort went beyond basic needs. women who dressed as men to fight or to travel in dangerous times faced all the same issues, and sometimes more. Hidden beneath layers of cloth and steel, they devised clever ways to relieve themselves, including makeshift funnels or slits in their clothing. Historians still argue whether the armour slit was common or a rare innovation, but the fact that it's even debated tells you everything about how desperate people were for a solution. If you think modern hikers complain about tricky bathroom breaks in the wild, just be glad you're not in full plate armour, with half your net worth strapped to your thighs and your squire nervously holding a bucket behind the next hedge. And for those knights who fought on horseback, things got even messier. Horses, of course, had no such inhibitions. Riders, meanwhile, tried to time their bodily needs with rest stops or hoped to find cover behind a shield. But battles seldom allowed such luxuries. One contemporary joke described a knight riding bravely into battle, splashing all the way. A not-so-subtle dig at the universal problem. Let's not overlook the other side of this misery, the squires. Young, underpaid, and endlessly patient, in theory, squires were responsible for helping knights don and doff their armour. They also dealt with the unglamorous aftermath. Some historical records mention squires washing gambesons and cleaning armour with sand, vinegar, or urine. Yes, urine was considered a cheap and effective cleaner, since it helped remove rust. Picture it. You've just endured the worst day of your life, and now your young assistant is dousing your battered, sweat and urine-soaked armour in more urine. Medieval life wasn't always chivalrous. Even outside battle, removing armour for bathroom breaks was a hassle. Tournaments often featured rest tents, where knights could retreat, unbuckle and freshen up. These tents were filled with half-dressed warriors grumbling about aching backs and tight straps. Privacy was limited, comfort even less so. At grand feasts after the tournament, knights would joke about the line at the latrine, trading stories about close calls and embarrassing mishaps. It's a mainstream historical fact. Even the greatest heroes had to deal with the most basic indignities. Richard the Lionheart, Edward the Black Prince, Joan of Arc, no matter their fame, they all faced the same human frailty. Beneath the shining armour, every knight was just another person, humbled by biology. This is where the image of the knight as a proud, untouchable hero starts to unravel. Beneath the layers of steel and bravado was someone just like you, hoping for a little privacy, praying the urge would pass and deeply, deeply regretting that last cup of wine. Yet the reality forged a strange camaraderie among warriors. There are letters and poems where knights joke about their embarrassing moments, poking fun at each other for emergencies narrowly avoided. In the tent or the tavern after battle, these stories became a kind of dark humour, a way to cope, to bond, and to remind each other that nobody, not even the king, was immune. Historians still argue whether the armour privy problem was truly universal, or if some knights really did find clever workarounds. Some claim that certain types of armour included strategically placed openings or flaps for urgent situations. Others scoff, insisting that most knights simply endured, proof that suffering was part of the code. The debate remains open, but one thing is clear: no matter how grand the armour, every knight eventually met a moment of very undignified truth. So next time you see a glorious painting of a knight on horseback, sword raised high, remember the unseen struggles. Remember the agony of holding it in, the anxiety of finding a moment's peace, and the groan of relief when finally, after hours of waiting, you can cast off your armour, at least for a little while. As daylight fades and you drag your battered body from the field, another weight settles on your mind, this one less tangible, but just as crushing as the steel that presses into your shoulders. The sheer mass of armour isn't just a physical burden, it's an emotional and psychological load too. Each piece strapped to your body, every ounce added to your limbs, shapes not only how you move, but how you think, how you feel, and sometimes how you fight. The numbers alone are intimidating. A full suit of late medieval plate armour, even perfectly made, could weigh anywhere from 45 to 70 pounds, 20 to 32 kilograms. Add in a mail shirt, thick padding, weapons, and maybe a heavy shield, and you might easily top 100 pounds. That's the equivalent of carrying another person, a stubborn, unhelpful person, on your back for hours on end. From the moment you stand up, the weight is there, reminding you of its presence with every breath. It doesn't matter how strong you are, how well you trained, or how many battles you've survived. The armour makes you slow, cautious, and after a while deeply weary. Let's start with your legs. Each step in greaves and sabatons, the armour for shins and feet, is deliberate and forced. The metal adds a new gravity, an invisible chain, to every motion. Walking uphill or through mud becomes a test of willpower. Walking down a hill, a dangerous game of balance where a stumble means tumbling like a tin toy down to the bottom. Knights trained for years to build the muscles needed for this, but no training could completely erase the sense of trudging through a swamp of fatigue. And it's not just your legs. Your core and shoulders bear the brunt. The cuirass and backplate are heavy, pressing down on your spine and ribs. The weight shifts awkwardly as you twist and turn, tugging at your lower back, threatening to unbalance you at the worst possible moment. Your neck, strained by the helmet's heft, aches constantly. There's a mainstream historical fact that modern reenactors and historians have proved time and again. While a fit person can move in armour, it's a constant struggle, and over time, exhaustion is guaranteed. In tournaments or on parade, knights might wear their armour for a few hours at most. On campaign or during long battles, though, the suit becomes a prison, draining strength and resolve with every moment. Imagine it. You start the day with your head high, adrenaline surging. By midday, the armour feels twice as heavy. Your steps shorten, your shoulders sag. Even the air seems thicker, heavier, as if it too is conspiring to slow you down. The battlefield becomes a surreal landscape of sluggish movement and clanking echoes, where time stretches and every action requires a conscious effort. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some knights developed what they called armour walk, a distinctive gait with knees bent and back stooped, designed to save energy and keep balance. Chronicles and tapestries show knights marching this way, less like regal warriors and more like overburdened labourers. Some even joked that the real challenge of chivalry was learning to walk again every single morning. For many, the weight took a mental toll too. The constant pressure, the lack of agility, the feeling of being trapped, all could trigger anxiety or even panic. If you were prone to claustrophobia, wearing a full suit was its own private nightmare. A helmet that blocked your vision and dulled your hearing made the world close in until you felt almost suffocated. And if you stumbled or fell, the panic could rise quickly, especially if you landed awkwardly and needed help to get up. Historians still debate just how much this psychological burden affected knights. Some say the training and tradition of knighthood forged mental resilience. Others point to records of men breaking down, refusing to wear full armour, or even discarding pieces mid-battle in desperation. The truth, as always, probably lay in the middle. Some adapted, some endured, and some suffered quietly, their heroics hidden by the heavy shell they wore. It's not just on the field either. The pressure of wearing armour didn't stop when the battle ended. After the fight, your body was sore, bruised, and often trembling from exertion. It could take half an hour or more for a squire to help you out of your shell. The relief of shedding each plate was immense, a sensation akin to crawling out of a too-tight sleeping bag after a sweltering night. The air felt cooler. Your limbs felt lighter. But the exhaustion lingered, and so did the aches. For days after a long campaign, you moved gingerly, like someone decades older than your years. There's a recurring joke among reenactors and medievalists. The first thing every knight did after a long battle was invent yoga. Stretching, twisting, kneading sore muscles, anything to recover some sense of normalcy after the punishing embrace of steel. And the emotional burden wasn't limited to individuals. Commanders had to factor the weight of armour into every tactical plan. Marches took longer, and breaks were more frequent. Horses, too, bore the extra load. War horses were selected and bred for their strength, but even they tired more quickly with a fully armoured rider. Sometimes, when knights dismounted to fight on foot, their horses were led away simply to spare them the weight. The weight even shaped the culture of knighthood itself. Only those with years of training and enough wealth for the best equipment could hope to survive the ordeal. Armour became both a badge of honour and a symbol of privilege. A gleaming shell that marked you as elite, but also set you apart from the more lightly armoured foot soldiers. There's an undercurrent of class tension here, rarely discussed in legend but ever present in reality. The heavy armour that protected you also isolated you, making you both admired and resented by those who had to fight with little more than padded jackets or thin mail. Sometimes the sheer burden of armour could decide a battle. If the sun was too hot or the march too long, entire armies slowed to a crawl, unable to reach the field in time. There are accounts of knights arriving late to a skirmish, their faces red and swollen, their steps unsteady, simply because the weight of their armour had worn them down on the journey. Commanders who failed to account for this could lose wars before the fighting even started. But even in defeat, there was a strange pride in endurance. Chronicles celebrate not only the heroes who slew dozens of foes, but also those who simply survived the day in their steel shells. Squires told stories of their master's strength. Sir Geoffrey marched 10 miles in plate and never fell once, as if walking in armour were a heroic deed on par with slaying a dragon. Sometimes the weight played tricks on your mind. You'd imagine the armour growing heavier with every step, as if some invisible force wanted you to collapse. In your lowest moments, you might even curse your beautiful suit, the symbol of your station and pride. You might whisper, as you staggered off the field, "Let the next hero carry this. I'll take my chances in a padded coat." But by dawn you'd be back, buckling on each piece, resigned to the burden once more. Because the truth was clear, armour was both your prison and your shield. It weighed you down, but it also stood between you and a sudden, violent end. That was the deal, and knights accepted it with as much grace as they could muster. There's one last quirky note. Some knights, on days off, would challenge each other to weight races, running short distances in armour to prove their stamina. The winner earned not just bragging rights, but sometimes a little extra wine at supper. These races were loud, ungainly, and often ended in laughter as exhausted men toppled over, their pride dented but their spirits high. Historians still argue whether armour was too heavy to fight in, or heavy but manageable. Modern tests suggest that a well-made suit could be worn for hours by a trained, fit person, but only with regular rest and water. Most agree, though, that after a day in armour even the strongest knight would be ready to collapse. So the next time you watch a film where the hero battles all day and dances all night in shining steel, remember the unseen truth. Every victory came with an invisible burden, a weight carried in silence by every armoured soul. And every time the armour came off, it felt like a small miracle, one that, for many nights, was worth all the pain, all the exhaustion, and all the scars. You're standing in the midst of chaos, sword raised, sweat stinging your eyes, and suddenly the world goes silent, except for the relentless roar reverberating inside your own head. Welcome to the peculiar, deafening world of a steel-encased knight, where every clang, every shout, every thud of hoof and boot is filtered through the echo chamber of your helmet. If you thought battle was loud, try living it from inside a personal drum. It starts the moment you lower your visor. With a sharp metallic click, the outside world muffles instantly, like someone pulling a pillow over your head. Your ears ring, but the sounds aren't gone. They're transformed. Gone is the crisp cacophony of battle, the distant war cries, the barking of orders, the whinnies of terrified horses. What remains is a muddy jumble of vibrations, a mixture of your own rapid breathing, the metallic clatter of your armour, and the heartbeat thudding in your ears. The first thing you notice, besides the stuffy heat, is that everything sounds closer than it actually is. Every step you take sends a rattle up your spine. When your gauntlet brushes your cuirass, it sounds like a hammer on an anvil. You become hyper-aware of the little noises. Your sword scraping in its scabbard, the squeak of leather straps, the groan of hinges as you try to turn your head. It's almost comic in a way. You imagine you look terrifying, the living embodiment of chivalric legend, but from the inside you're just a bundle of nerves reacting to every ping and pinging at every movement. Sometimes, when you least expect it, your own armour will let out a shriek, a buckle scraping suddenly against a breastplate, or the snap of a poorly tied arming point. You flinch, certain every enemy for 100 yards must have heard, when in reality the sound is trapped, bouncing only inside your helmet, a private ghost haunting your skull. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The inside of a medieval helmet was a sensory nightmare. Studies by modern historians and reenactors confirm that helmets, especially the enclosed types like the Great Helm or Close Helmet, could amplify the wearer's own movements while muting everything else. You could hear yourself breathing but barely catch a shouted command. In the noise and confusion of battle, this made communication nearly impossible. Knights developed all kinds of workarounds, prearranged signals, bright banners, distinctive horn blasts, but even these had limits. Once the fighting began, chaos often won out. Historians still argue whether commanders preferred to fight with open or closed visors, weighing the risk of an arrow or sword to the face against the certainty of missing orders or warning cries. Let's not forget the psychological effect. Imagine being trapped in a tin box during a thunderstorm. Every raindrop, every rumble is amplified, the sound pressing in from all sides. For a knight in battle, that sense of being isolated, cut off, could trigger fear, confusion, even panic. And there's more. The sound of battle isn't just outside the armour, it's inside too. Each blow you take sends a jarring shock through your plates, which resonates as a boom in your ears. A sword strike to the helmet doesn't sound like a movie clang. It's a concussive hollow thud, followed by a moment of ringing silence. A lance striking your shield or a mace thumping your breastplate is a full-body experience. Pain, vibration, and deafening noise all at once. A quirky tidbit. Some knights tried stuffing scraps of wool, moss, or even wax into their ears before battle. This was only partly about dulling pain or fear. Mostly it was to muffle the worst of the internal racket. A few commanders even experimented with quilted helmet liners, which helped a little, if you didn't mind feeling even hotter. And then there's the chaos of being knocked down. If you've ever dropped a metal pan in a kitchen and heard it rattle around, you've got a sense of what it's like to hit the ground in armour. Suddenly the world is noise, helmet ringing, body plates clanging, vision bouncing in time with every impact. You don't just hear battle, you are battle, a one-man percussion section trapped in your own echo chamber. Historians are still debating whether the confusion and disorientation caused by helmet noise contributed to friendly fire or panicked retreats. Some chronicles describe units scattering after a single loud crack, not realizing in the muddled din of battle that the noise was only a dropped weapon or a nearby collision, not an enemy breakthrough. The combination of reduced vision, stifled sound, and overtaxed nerves created countless moments of accidental disaster. Your own sense of self shifts inside the armour. You feel less like a human and more like a machine, an awkward, clattering automaton. The metal dulls sensation, masks pain, and sometimes gives you a false sense of invulnerability, until the next heavy blow snaps you back to reality. It's strange. You're both hyper-alert, on edge with every clang, and strangely detached, moving as if underwater, deaf to the details of the world beyond your visor. There's even some gallows humour in the records. One knight joked that his wife had threatened to make him wear his helmet to bed, so she wouldn't have to listen to his stories. Another claimed that after a particularly long day he dreamed in echoes, every thought accompanied by a clank. The confusion extends off the field too. In the bustle of a camp, a fully armoured knight becomes both imposing and a bit ridiculous, answering every question with "what?" or "speak up." If you've ever tried talking to someone wearing headphones at full blast, you know the feeling. Sometimes a knight might lift his visor to chat, only to be rewarded with a face full of dust, or a fly, or a stray gob of mud. You quickly learn to rely on your eyes. Gestures, signals, and patterns become your new language. The gleam of a friend's helmet, the rise and fall of a banner, the flash of a shield. These are how you track friend from foe, order from chaos. And yet there are countless stories of confusion. Knights accidentally charging their own lines, or missing the signal to retreat simply because the noise and echoing made every direction uncertain. There's a certain humour to it all. Your armour, meant to protect you, becomes an amplifier of your own weaknesses. You flinch at your own footsteps. You grow paranoid, second-guessing every sound. Even in moments of victory, you might not hear the cheering until you take off your helmet. Only then does the world return, bright and loud and unmistakably real. But in the rare moments of quiet, late at night, armour off, head still buzzing, you realise you've been living in a different world. One where the boundaries are steel and sound, where the world is shrunk to the space inside your helmet. Some nights confess to hating the silence that followed battle almost as much as the noise. When the echoes faded, what was left was the memory, replayed again and again, a private din no one else could hear. Historians still argue about the long-term effects. Did knights grow deaf with age? Did their sense of hearing dull? Or did they simply learn to filter out the worst? Medical texts from the period are vague, but there's more than a little evidence that lifelong warriors spoke louder, laughed harder, and seemed always to be just a bit hard of hearing. It's easy to romanticize the life of a knight, to imagine yourself strong and silent in the heart of the storm. But the truth is more complicated, and perhaps more human. Beneath the gleaming shell is someone startled by their own footsteps, someone who can't hear their friends calling, someone who dreams of a single, quiet day with the breeze on their face. So tonight, as you listen to the soft hush of the world around you, take a moment to be grateful for the comfort of sound, the ability to hear, clearly and truly, those you care about. Remember the knights who lived for years inside their own noisy shadows, who fought bravely but never really escaped the ringing echo of battle. You blink, sweat burning your eyes, your head throbbing with the relentless din inside your helmet. You try to catch your breath and focus, just for a second. But even as your heart pounds and your hands tighten around your sword, another harsh reality of being an armoured knight strikes you. You can hardly see anything at all. Visibility, when locked inside a steel shell, is more hope than guarantee. The world narrows to whatever slivers of light and colour make it through your visor's tiny slits or round holes. On the battlefield, you fight not just for your life, but for every glimpse of what's actually happening around you. The design of helmets was always a balancing act, protection versus perception. The great helms of the 13th and 14th centuries, those iconic bucket helmets, offered superb defence against swords and arrows, but they had small, rectangular eye slits barely wider than 2 fingers. The idea was simple. The smaller the opening, the harder it was for an enemy's blade or arrow to reach your eyes, but this safety came at the cost of tunnel vision. Imagine peering out from inside a mailbox or a narrow slot in a door. That's your reality as you walk, or rather clank, into battle. You see straight ahead and not much else. To glance left or right, you have to turn your entire body. Want to look down? Prepare to hunch your whole torso. Want to spot an incoming arrow from above, or a foot soldier sneaking up on your flank? Good luck. You're essentially wearing a set of medieval blinders, forced to trust your instincts, and maybe the shouted warnings of your friends if you can hear them over the ringing in your ears. Even more advanced helmets like the visored bassinet or the later close helm try to solve the problem with different shapes and configurations of slits and holes. The sallet, for example, often featured an extended tail to protect the back of the neck, but the eye openings were still narrow. The armet, popular during the Renaissance, had hinged cheek pieces and sometimes even a removable faceplate, offering a little more flexibility. But as a rule, more protection meant less vision. The effect on your sense of space and awareness is immediate and unnerving. battle is all around you. Men screaming, swords flashing, horses bolting, banners flapping, arrows zipping by. But you're trapped in a metal box, catching only glimpses of the chaos, forced to guess where your enemies are, where your friends are, where the next danger is coming from. The urge to lift your visor, just for a second, is overwhelming. But you know better. You've heard the stories of knights who lifted their visors to catch a breath, only to be blinded by a splinter, felled by an arrow, or smacked in the teeth by a well-aimed pommel. Here's a mainstream historical fact. More than a few knights met their end because they lifted their visors at the wrong moment. Chroniclers record tales of men who, desperate for air or sight, exposed their faces, sometimes only for an instant, only to be struck down. Some commanders even ordered their men to keep visors locked until a trumpet sounded the all clear. It was a cruel trade-off. Survive the fight, but endure it in near darkness. The danger of poor visibility wasn't limited to open battlefields. In tournaments where knights jousted in front of thousands, the crowd's gasps and roars faded into muffled background noise behind the helmet's walls. A split-second decision, lowering the lance or steering the horse, became a matter of muscle memory and luck more than sight. Mistakes were common. There are records of knights riding straight off the end of the lists, unable to see where the barriers ended. Others accidentally struck judges, horses, or even their own squires, mistaking them for opponents in the swirling confusion. Historians still argue whether some of the more ornate helmets, those with decorative visors shaped like animal faces, grimacing masks, or huge crests, were ever meant for real combat. Some say they were for parades, tournaments, or ceremonial use only. Others point to battlefields where even the most impractical design showed up, as if knights sometimes chose appearance over function, or just didn't have another option. There's a quirky tidbit buried in the accounts of the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. A German knight, frustrated by his limited vision, reportedly tied a bright red ribbon around his arm so his comrades could spot him more easily, because, as he put it, "I cannot see anything but a blur, so at least let them see me." The story ends badly for him. His helmet visor jammed and he was eventually captured. But the detail survives. Knights knew they were half blind, and they did what they could to compensate. For many, this sense of blindness created a kind of constant low-grade panic. Every shadow, every flicker at the edge of sight set your nerves on edge. Sometimes the anticipation was worse than the reality. The dread of what might be coming, unseen at any moment. There are letters and chronicles where knights describe the sensation of hearing the battle more than seeing it, trusting to sound, to the press of bodies, to instinct, and to luck. In the middle of the melee you might not know what hit you, just that it came out of nowhere, as most things do when you can only see straight ahead. Yet knights adapted in all sorts of ways. Some practiced for hours in their helmets, memorizing the feel of their armour, their weapons, the movement of their horses. Others trusted their squires or sergeants to act as their eyes, watching for threats and shouting warnings. Certain formations were designed to keep heavily armoured knights in the centre, with lighter troops on the flanks to spot incoming dangers. There were even training games where young knights fought with their eyes half closed, learning to read the world through vibrations, shouts, and the tremors of their own armour. There's a poignant account from the Siege of Orleans in 1429, where a knight wrote to his wife, "When I close my eyes at night, I see only darkness, and it is the same as in the day." The line has always struck historians as both a complaint and a badge of courage. These men walked willingly into battle, knowing that half the time they'd be fighting blind. Visibility was also a problem at night or in bad weather. Rain and mud spattered visors and slits, further clouding your view. In winter, condensation from your breath could freeze inside your helmet, turning eye slits into tiny ice windows. Snow, dust, and even insects could gather inside the narrow gaps, driving you to distraction. Modern reenactors often comment on how disorienting it is to fight in period-accurate helmets. Even in a controlled environment with no real danger, the claustrophobia is real. The world shrinks to a narrow field, and the rest of your senses strain to fill the gap. Some even describe a sort of combat trance, a state where you stop trying to see everything and instead focus on movement, rhythm, and instinct. Here's another curious fact. Some late medieval helmets included removable or pivoting visors, allowing knights to lift them briefly between charges. Others had clever sliding plates or hidden catches, offering a split second of relief. But the more moving parts a helmet had, the more likely something would break or jam at the worst possible time. One chronicle tells of a famous English knight who, unable to close his visor before a crucial duel, had to fight with one eye squinted shut, trying desperately not to expose his face. Historians still debate the long-term impact of restricted vision on battlefield tactics. Did it make knights more cautious? Did it force armies to fight in tighter formations? Some believe it contributed to the rise of push-of-pike tactics, where soldiers pressed together so tightly that individual sight was less important than the pressure of the mass. Others think it explains why archers and crossbowmen, fighters who could see and shoot freely, were so often the decisive force in medieval battles. For all these dangers, most knights would never have traded their armour for an open face. The memory of comrades struck down by flying arrows or shattered lances was too fresh, the threat too real, and so you march forward, peering through the slit, feeling half blind but trusting that you are safer this way. You move as best you can, eyes darting for every scrap of information, every flicker of movement. When at last the battle ends, you rip off your helmet and blink into the daylight, dazed, grateful, and aware that you survived, not by sight, but by 1,000 tiny acts of trust. Trust in your armour, your comrades, and the unyielding will that pushes you through the darkness toward the uncertain promise of victory. After surviving another suffocating, noisy, and near-blind day in armour, you'd think your ordeal was over. But just as you stagger from the field, bone-tired, desperate to shed your steel shell, a new reality sets in. The work is never done. Now comes the part no one sings songs about, the part that separates the true knights from the merely ambitious, the never-ending misery of armour maintenance. Armour, for all its gleaming glory, is an unforgiving companion. The moment the fighting stops, you realise just how much of your life is about to be spent hunched over buckles, scrub brushes, and bottles of pungent vinegar. Each battle, each rainy march, each dusty trek across the countryside leaves your suit battered, grimy, and on the verge of betraying you if you neglect it for even a night. The first thing you do, if you're lucky enough to have survived, is find your squire. He's waiting with a bundle of tools, oil, rags, and no small amount of dread. Peeling the armour off your aching body is a task in itself. Buckles have jammed, straps are twisted, maybe the odd rivet popped loose in the chaos. Your padding is soaked in sweat, your chainmail clogged with mud and bits of grass, your breastplate streaked with rust where the morning dew mixed with enemy blood. If you thought putting armour on was a production, taking it off and caring for it is an epic unto itself. And you can't wait. Rust is your new worst enemy, sneaky, persistent, and always hungry. In damp climates, you can practically see it growing overnight. One evening's neglect could mean hours of extra scrubbing, or worse, a weakened link or plate that cracks at the worst possible moment. Many knights grew up hearing horror stories of men whose mail tore in a critical spot, or whose breastplates snapped after being left unpolished for a few days. Armourers told these stories to scare their customers into diligence, and it worked. There's a mainstream historical fact here. A full set of plate armour required hours of daily care, and that was assuming you had a trained squire to help. The armour had to be wiped down, scraped clean, polished with oil or fat, and sometimes even scoured with sand or ashes if rust had taken hold. Every strap and buckle needed checking. Linings, if removable, had to be hung up to dry and cleaned of sweat or blood. Gauntlets, greaves, and helmets needed their hinges oiled and moving parts flexed repeatedly to prevent seizing up. A quirky tidbit. Medieval squires often used urine as a cheap cleaning agent. It sounds odd, but urine, full of ammonia, helped dissolve rust and remove stains. There are records of squire peeing on their master's armour and then scrubbing furiously, or of knights joking that their suit smelled worse after cleaning than before the battle. Sometimes vinegar or wine was used instead, but these were expensive and thus reserved for the wealthiest households, and if you were rich and important, maybe you had several squires or a full staff of yeoman armourers, each specialising in particular pieces, one for mail, one for plate, one for the intricate etching or inlay on your family crest. The truly elite could even afford gilded or painted armour, which needed extra gentle care to preserve its elaborate patterns. You might think gold was impervious to tarnish, but even gold leaf could wear thin, and paint could chip with every blow. Keeping armour both functional and beautiful was a matter of pride and endless toil. But most knights weren't so lucky. For every grand lord with an entourage, there were dozens of working knights who did their own maintenance after battle, crouched by the campfire, scraping and oiling, nursing blisters and bruised knuckles. Some paid for help, hiring armourers' boys who travelled with the army. Others simply did the best they could, knowing that a rusty rivet or a snapped buckle could spell disaster. The upkeep wasn't just about the armour's outer shine. Chainmail in particular was a magnet for trouble. Each link could harbour moisture and grit, creating hundreds of tiny rust traps. After a wet day, you'd have to stretch out the mail shirt ring by ring, sometimes beating it gently with a wooden mallet to shake out the water and mud. Some soldiers reportedly wore their mail to bed, using their own body heat to dry it. A miserable, smelly process, but better than waking up to a frozen or rusted hauberk. Maintaining the inside of armour was just as important. The padded arming doublet, your one line of comfort, absorbed sweat by the pint, and if left unwashed, it quickly became a breeding ground for sores, infections and parasites. Fleas and lice were common, and after a long campaign you might find your gambeson nearly as stiff as the steel itself. Historical letters are full of complaints about the itch that never leaves, and there's more than one poem cursing the bugs that made life inside armour even worse. Linings and padding could sometimes be removed and washed, but drying them in damp weather was nearly impossible. In castles and manors, great halls were hung with padded armour parts, drying by the fire or airing out in the sun. On campaign you made do, stringing up your filthy doublet between two spears and praying for wind. But even with the best care, armour aged quickly. Dents and cracks had to be hammered out, edges sharpened or blunted, new straps replaced old, rotten leather. Many knights carried a small repair kit with spare rivets, bits of leather, a punch, and a hammer, so they could make quick fixes in the field. Still, there are stories of men forced to patch their armour with rope, fabric, or even wooden splints after especially fierce fights. And of course, none of this was free. Every hour you spent cleaning, repairing, or replacing armour was an hour you weren't training, resting, or planning for battle. The cost was constant, the work never ending. No wonder many knights looked enviously at archers and foot soldiers whose simpler gear could be mended in a fraction of the time. The expense went beyond time. Armour was one of the most costly investments a knight could make, often costing as much as a small house. The best suits were imported from Milan, Augsburg, or London, each piece fitted to your body, often passed down as treasured heirlooms. Some knights fell into debt to buy or maintain their armour. Others, less fortunate, made do with hand-me-downs or scavenged pieces from the dead after a battle. The sight of mismatched suits was common, shoulder plates from one suit, a helmet from another, patched and cobbled together in hopes of holding off the next attack. There's a vivid record from the Battle of Towton in 1461, where men scavenged the field after the fighting, trading battered helmets and mail shirts like currency. The armourers worked through the night, their hammers never still, as each man tried to save what he could from the ruin, one chronicler wrote. Even in victory, knights knew their next battle would depend as much on their armour's condition as their own courage. A quirky detail, in some households cleaning armour became a punishment for misbehaving squires. "You shall polish until it gleams, and then polish again," one lord reportedly said to a careless boy. Tales like these became cautionary jokes. Mind your manners, or you'll be stuck with a vinegar rag all winter. And even the most careful knight could lose everything in a moment. A lost helmet, a stolen breastplate, a snapped mail shirt. Any of these meant frantic letters to family or creditors, begging for funds to buy a replacement. More than one career ended early when a knight simply couldn't afford to keep up with the relentless demands of his gear. Yet despite all this misery, armour had its rewards. A well-kept suit was a mark of pride, a symbol of status and survival. Knights posed for portraits in their finest mail, their crests gleaming, their breastplates reflecting the light. "I survived because I cared for my harness," one old veteran said, his words recorded in a dusty margin. "Let those who forget perish." Armour maintenance was a labour of love, or at least of necessity. Each dent you hammered out, each rust spot you scrubbed away, was an act of faith in tomorrow's battle, a promise to yourself that you'd be ready, that you'd done everything possible to keep fate at bay. In a world where luck and skill might fail in a second, the simple act of oiling your breastplate was both a prayer and a small rebellion against chaos. So, after the roar of battle faded, and the world shrank to the circle of firelight and the soft scraping of rags on steel, you found a strange peace. Maybe you complained, maybe you cursed, but as the armour shone again under your hands, you felt, just for a moment, that you'd taken control, if only over this one hard, gleaming shell. That was the secret every knight knew. Survival depended not just on bravery, but on endless, stubborn care for the thing that might one day save your life. As the campfire glows and you finally settle, armour stacked in a weary pile, another question gnaws at your mind. A question that's haunted warriors for centuries. Did all this effort, all this agony, actually make you safer? Did armour really mean the difference between life and death? Or was it just an expensive illusion of security? This debate is as old as armour itself. Medieval knights, their squires, their wives, their accountants, and, most of all, their enemies, wondered whether those countless hours and coins spent on forging and maintaining mail and plate actually paid off when the arrows flew and swords flashed. Even today, historians still argue whether armour was a true advantage or a cumbersome liability, protection or a prison. Let's start with the basics. There's no denying the obvious. Armour did save lives. The earliest mail shirts, hauberks, were marvels of engineering, each tiny iron ring painstakingly linked to thousands of others. When faced with a glancing sword or an arrow shot from a distance, mail could turn aside a blow or slow it enough that the flesh beneath was only bruised, not split. Later, with the rise of full plate armour, a knight could walk into a storm of arrows and with a bit of luck walk out again, bruised but breathing. One mainstream historical fact stands out. During the 100 Years' War, chroniclers marvelled at how French and English knights survived attacks that would have slaughtered lightly armoured infantry. At battles like Agincourt, men-at-arms pressed forward through rain and mud, arrows clattering harmlessly off breastplates and helmets, their armour buying them precious moments, sometimes even saving entire lines from collapse. But there's another side to this coin, and it's sharp. As soon as armour improved, so did the weapons designed to defeat it. Arrowheads became heavier, with needle points for punching through mail. Maces, warhammers, and poleaxes appeared on the battlefield, not just to slash but to smash and pierce. Crossbows and later primitive firearms upped the stakes even further. And here's where the debate grows tangled. Did armour really keep pace with its enemies, or was it a never-ending game of catch-up? Some experts argue that armour always had the edge. A well-made breastplate could shrug off most arrows, and only the strongest longbows or crossbows fired at close range had a chance of breaking through. For decades, armourers added fluting, extra thickness, and careful curves to redirect blows, turning each suit into a miniature fortress. Archaeological digs reveal suits so well made that centuries later, their steel is still unbroken, bearing only the scars of battle. but others point to the brutal facts. The records are full of dead knights, men pierced through eye slits, knocked senseless by crushing blows, or pulled down and finished off in the mud by foes who knew exactly where to strike. Pole weapons could hook a knight's foot or drag him from his horse. Axes could smash joints. Daggers with thin, sharp points were designed for slipping between plates or through the mail. When fighting grew desperate and close, the advantage of armour often came down to luck, and how quickly you could move when your world turned upside down. A quirky tidbit. During the War of the Roses, some chroniclers complained that battles had turned into slow, exhausting wrestling matches, with armoured men grappling on the ground, unable to land a killing blow through each other's protection. Many a man did tire and faint, yet none did die, one wrote. Perhaps exaggerating for effect, but capturing the reality that armour could turn a melee into a grim contest of stamina as much as skill. It wasn't just weapons that changed the game. The environment too played a role. In sweltering heat or freezing rain, armour could become a liability. Men collapsed from exhaustion, drowned in marshes, or froze as water seeped into their mail. Sometimes survival depended not on what you wore, but on where you stood when the charge broke or the rout began. This uncertainty haunts the accounts of every era. Historians still argue whether plate armour actually extended life or simply prolonged suffering. Was it better to go lightly armoured and run, or to trust in steel and risk falling behind? At the Battle of Bannockburn, Scottish infantrymen in leather jerkins outpaced and outlasted their heavily armoured English foes, whose armour weighed them down in the mud. But at Crécy, Poitiers and so many other fields, it was the armoured men who made the final desperate stands, their shining shells becoming both shield and shroud. And the cost. The most beautiful armour, etched, gilded, tailored like a second skin, was reserved for the wealthy few. Most men-at-arms wore hand-me-downs, odd bits, or whatever they could scavenge. For every nobleman who boasted of armour's virtues, a dozen foot soldiers grumbled about its price and pain. Then came gunpowder, and the debate shifted once more. Early firearms could punch through even the thickest plate. Suddenly, armourers found themselves outmatched. The era of the fully armoured knight waned, replaced by lighter cuirasses, buff coats, and eventually the red coats and blue coats of a new world. Yet, for centuries after, the image of the armoured knight survived, a symbol of a time when courage and craftsmanship stood between a man and death. Still, there were plenty of quirks along the way. Some knights tried to adapt, layering armour in creative ways or adding secret reinforcements to their most vulnerable spots. Others turned to superstition, tucking relics, charms, or even love letters inside their breastplates for luck. One famous French knight was found after a disastrous rout with a small painted icon of St. George, proof, perhaps, that he believed faith might do what steel could not. So, did armour save lives? Absolutely. Sometimes. Did it fail? Of course. Often. The line between victory and defeat, life and death, was as thin as the edge of a dagger. But for every fallen knight, there were hundreds more who walked away from the field, battered but breathing, and lived to polish their armour for another day. It's an open question, one historians will likely never settle. Perhaps the real answer lies not in the steel, but in the souls of those who wore it, in the courage to trust their armour, in the grit to endure its burden, and in the wisdom to know when to cast it aside and run for their lives. So tonight, as you lie safely in your bed, you can reflect on this age-old debate, one that echoes from the muddy fields of France to the quiet corners of every mind that's ever wondered, was it worth it? Maybe, just maybe, there's comfort in the not knowing. For in the end, armour is both shield and question mark, a silent, gleaming testament to the struggle for survival and the limits of what any one suit of steel can truly protect. You wake before dawn, not to the sound of birdsong or sunlight streaming through wooden shutters, but to the soft grunt of your squire hauling a bundle of training gear into your tent. It's time to prepare for battle, not with swords or spears, but with sweat. Because wearing armour wasn't just a matter of putting it on and hoping for the best. To survive in plate, you had to train relentlessly. The iron suit didn't forgive the unfit. Despite what modern myth suggests, knights weren't all pampered nobles sipping wine between wars. Many were athletes in their own right, trained from adolescence in the art of movement beneath metal. By the time you earned your spurs, your days had long been filled with squats in mail, sprints in plate, and endless drills designed to make that 60-pound exoskeleton feel like second skin. A mainstream historical fact, training for combat in armour was a gruelling regular ritual in knightly households. Manuals from the 14th and 15th centuries, like those of Johannes Lichtenauer and Fiore de Liberi, detail rigorous regimens meant to condition knights not only in swordplay, but in endurance, grappling, mounted combat, and fighting in full gear. These weren't theoretical textbooks, they were survival guides. The day might begin with mounted exercises. Riding in armour was a skill of its own. Balancing your extra weight on a moving animal required absolute control. You'd practice galloping, halting, turning, drawing your sword, and even jumping over obstacles, all while encased in steel. A misstep could send you tumbling. Getting up again, not a task you wanted to face during a real battle. Next came footwork. You might spend hours walking or jogging in full armour, up hills, through forests, or across muddy courtyards. Your instructors, usually grizzled veterans with no patience for excuses, shouted commands as you struggled to lift your knees, each step a test of endurance. You'd sweat through your gambeson before the sun hit its peak. And then the real workout began: sword drills, poleaxe drills, shield and mace practice. You'd spar with partners until your arms shook, your legs quivered, and your lungs burned. Blunted weapons meant fewer bruises, but that didn't make the blows any lighter. You learned to move with economy, no flashy flourishes, just short, brutal efficiency. Waste a breath or an inch, and your opponent would exploit it. You trained in heat and cold, in full daylight and dim candlelight. You practiced in silence, and then again with horns blaring and men shouting, to simulate the battlefield's chaos. Sometimes your trainer would blindfold you. Other times you'd have to fight with your visor down, breathing in the stifling heat, relying only on sound and touch. And the grappling. Oh, the grappling. Medieval combat wasn't all sweeping sword fights. When enemies closed in, your sword became a lever, your hands became claws. You learned how to trip, lock, shove, and throw while weighed down by armour. Wrestling in plate was like brawling in a rain barrel. Every move limited, every breath a labour. Manuals taught how to grab an enemy by the visor, twist a dagger into a joint, or wrench a man's helmet sideways to break his balance. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some knightly training routines involved games, what we might call team building with bruises. Jousting was the famous one, but there were others too. Knights chased pigs through mud while in armour, to improve agility, climbed ladders with weights on their backs, or engaged in elaborate mock duels where the loser had to serve wine all evening. These exercises were brutal, yes, but they also built morale and trust among comrades. Despite all this effort, armour still exhausted even the best. Chroniclers describe knights who could fight for hours, but also those who, after 10 minutes of real combat, staggered away, white-faced and trembling. No amount of training could completely erase the toll. Your muscles learned the subtle, unnatural rhythms of life in plate. You adjusted your stride, your posture, your breath. You knew which angle let your knee bend without pinching, which wrist movement let your gauntlet close just enough for a clean grip. Over time, your body changed. Knights were stocky for a reason, not just vanity, but necessity. Thin limbs couldn't swing a sword all day in steel. You grew calluses in strange places, your shoulders thickened, your back stiffened. You learned to live inside the shell. There's a saying in old manuals, "The armour teaches the man." It wasn't just a poetic line, it was a fact. You could read every book on swordplay and still lose to someone who simply knew how to breathe right under 40 pounds of polished iron. Even peacetime demanded training. A knight was expected to stay ready, whether summoned by his lord or challenged in a tournament. Months without practice made your movements clumsy. You forgot the rhythm. So, you trained. Every day. In pouring rain, in blistering sun, in early spring mud and winter frost. You didn't do it to win glory. You did it so you wouldn't die in the first 30 seconds of battle. Historians still argue whether the average knight was truly fit by modern standards. Some point to records of injuries and fatigue. Others cite accounts of tremendous endurance. But the evidence leans clear. The knights who survived longest weren't just brave or rich. They were hardened by years of sweat and repetition. You couldn't fake strength. You couldn't bluff endurance. The armour told the truth. Even squires trained, first in padding, then in lighter mail, building the muscles they'd need when they finally inherited full plate. By the time they were knighted, their bodies knew the weight, the movement, the limitations. They didn't just wear armour, they wore it like a second skin, albeit one that bruised you regularly. At the end of the day, you collapsed onto a bench, poured sweat from your collar, and let your squire unbuckle you piece by piece. Your shirt stuck to your skin. Your hands trembled from the weight, but your heart still beat steady. You were stronger than yesterday, a little more ready for what waited in the next field, the next forest, the next siege, and tomorrow you'd do it all again, because in the life of a knight, training wasn't preparation, it was survival. You're halfway through the campaign season now, your joints ache, your squire snores, and the rain hasn't stopped in 3 days. But today, a new torment awaits. Not enemy arrows, not boiling pitch, not even the hunger gnawing your belly, no. Today it's the cold. Because armour, that shining saviour in battle, becomes something else entirely when the weather turns against you. There's no polite way to say it. Armour in extreme weather is a curse. In the summer it cooks you alive. In the winter it tries to freeze you from the inside out. Steel has no sympathy. It doesn't care about comfort. And once the temperatures drop, your faithful protection becomes a merciless conductor of the cold. Imagine stepping into a refrigerator barefoot, then wearing that refrigerator all day. That's what it's like walking in plate during a frosty campaign. The moment you touch your greaves or gauntlets in the morning, your fingers go numb. And then comes the worst part, pulling them on. The steel bites your skin, and the padded underlayers, still damp from yesterday, haven't dried in the misty freezing air. You shiver violently as you lace up your gambeson, whispering curses to St. Maurice and anyone else who might be listening. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Knights often had no choice but to fight and march through brutally cold conditions. The Battle of Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest battles in English history, was fought during a snowstorm so thick that soldiers could barely see. Chronicles describe warriors stumbling over corpses, swinging blindly, the snow mingling with blood, the wind howling through plate like a whistle through a church bell. And there's a quirky tidbit that captures just how bad it got. Knights sometimes stuffed straw, moss, or even chicken feathers inside their boots and gauntlets for insulation. Some tried wrapping their feet in fur or soaked wool, hoping the moisture would freeze slowly enough to avoid frostbite. Others simply huddled near fires, rotating like skewered pigs, drying one side while the other froze. But it wasn't just the cold, it was the damp. In medieval Europe, campaigns often slogged through marshes, riverbanks, or rain-drenched fields. Water seeped into armour seams. Padding grew mouldy, and once wet, metal took hours to dry, if it ever did. There are reports of knights battling trench foot, fungal infections, and even gangrene from prolonged exposure to the cold and wet combo under armour. Now flip the scene. Summer. You think you'll find relief until the sun starts climbing. Plate armour, shimmering in the morning light, becomes a portable oven by midday. Even mail heats up, absorbing sunlight and cooking your back like a griddle. Your breath grows shallow, your vision swims. You swat at flies with leaden hands while sweat pours from your brow into your collar. Sometimes, just standing still is agony. It's no surprise that many battles were decided not just by skill or strength, but by which side collapsed first from heat exhaustion. Knights fainted in the middle of charges. Horses stumbled from dehydration. Helmets baked scalps. Gauntlets burned palms. and when a wind finally did come, it was often hot and thick as a forge's breath. Historians still argue whether armour design ever truly adapted to deal with these extremes. Some say that later suits, especially Italian-made ones, featured better ventilation and lighter metals. Others insist that no matter how good the craftsmanship, armour was never truly weatherproof. It was always a calculated risk. And then came the rust. Rust wasn't just a nuisance, it was an enemy. A wet sword might still swing. But wet armour? It weakened. It stiffened. It flaked. If your breastplate rusted at the joints, you might not be able to raise your arms. If your visor stuck from corrosion, you could go blind in the middle of a duel. Maintaining armour during extreme weather became a full-time job, scraping, oiling, drying by firelight, praying that tomorrow wouldn't bring another storm. And yet, for all this discomfort, you never considered going without. Because as miserable as you were in the cold, wet, or sun, you knew that an arrow or sword would feel far worse. Armour was your burden, but it was also your bargain, suffer now or die later. Still, you learned a few tricks. You kept a pouch of salt to sprinkle on wet straps. You dried your gloves under your tunic close to your chest. You greased your joints with sheep tallow when oil ran out. You used your squire's spare shirt to wrap your sword hilt when the leather wore away. A knight wasn't just a warrior. He was an improvised survivalist. At night, you peeled the armour off, steam rising from your skin. You hung it beside the fire, turning the pieces like bread in a hearth. You stretched your aching limbs and rubbed warmth into your thighs. Maybe your comrades told stories. Maybe someone sang. But always, your eyes flicked back to the weather. Because tomorrow, it would start all over again. One last quirky example. In particularly wet winters, some knights fashioned makeshift armour cloaks. Oiled canvas tarps they'd drape over their armour while marching. They looked ridiculous, but they worked, at least enough to keep the worst of the rain off. A 15th century German knight even claimed he wrapped his entire upper body in waxed pigskin during a month-long campaign. It made me sweat, but I did not rot, he wrote dryly, and when all else failed, you muttered to your god, tightened your belt, and reminded yourself that comfort was for peasants and poets. You were a knight. You had work to do, because armour didn't care if it was snowing or blazing. It just clung to your body, merciless and mute, until the day you either removed it, or someone else did. You've made it this far, through blistering heat, freezing sleet, clumsy steps, and endless chafing. But the one thing you weren't prepared for, the thing that no amount of training or pride could ever fully prevent, is failure. Because despite the cost, despite the agony, and despite the legends, armour wasn't invincible. There's something deeply unsettling about hearing the words "it didn't work." Not from the blacksmith who forged it, or the squire who buckled it, but from the battlefield itself. Because that's where truth lives. On a muddy slope in France, on a rocky hill in Scotland, or in a dark forest in Bohemia, where the shine of steel meets the blunt end of reality. Armour was meant to be your second skin, your mobile fortress, and most of the time it did its job well. It turned aside arrows, diffused sword strikes, protected your organs from crushing blows. But even the best armour had breaking points, gaps, weak spots, and moments of catastrophic failure. And when it failed spectacularly. The most infamous example, the Battle of Agincourt, 1415. The French knights, weighed down by full plate, charged across wet farmland under a storm of English longbow fire. It should have been a rout in the French's favour. More men, better armour, noble blood. But the terrain betrayed them. Mud sucked at their feet, slowing them to a crawl. Arrows rained down, punching into visors, shoulders, and the thinner steel of armpits. The armour did its best, but the conditions overwhelmed it. Many knights fell and couldn't rise again. Some drowned face down in mud. Others were finished off by lightly armoured Englishmen wielding knives and hammers. It was a massacre, and it shook Europe's faith in heavy armour. Historians still argue whether Agincourt marked the decline of traditional plate armour. Some say it exposed its flaws. Others insist the failure was not the armour, but the strategy. Still, the image stuck. Knights, proud and shimmering, dragged down by their own weight and gear, felled not by a mighty foe, but by wet dirt and gravity. But it wasn't just mud and longbows. Sometimes armour failed in more personal, humiliating ways. Rivets popped mid-duel, exposing flesh. Visors jammed shut. Gauntlets slipped during a parry. Breastplates cracked under an unexpected axe swing. Chainmail tore where two links had rusted together unnoticed, and when it happened, there was no dramatic pause, no second chance, just pain, blood, and the sick realization that your body was no longer protected. One mainstream historical fact: the armourers of Milan and Augsburg, two of the most famous centres of armour production, worked tirelessly to improve joint coverage and reinforce vulnerable points, but even their best efforts couldn't fully shield areas like the groin, underarms, inner elbows, or the back of the knees. These spots had to remain somewhat flexible for movement, and every knight knew it. That's why skilled opponents aimed there. A poleaxe to the shoulder might bounce off, a dagger thrust under your armpit. That could end everything. And let's not forget the brutal effectiveness of blunt weapons. Maces, warhammers, and flanged axes weren't designed to slice, they were designed to crush. Armour might stop the blade, but it couldn't stop the force. You could survive the impact, but that didn't mean you walked away. Your ribs might be intact, but your organs would be pulp. Your head might not be pierced, but you'd be unconscious from the blow. This was the reality knights feared most, being left alive but unable to fight, lying helpless in a shell that was supposed to be their salvation. A quirky tidbit from the 15th century. Some knights began reinforcing their helmets with extra interior padding, not for arrows, but for concussions. Chroniclers mention men who fought entire battles disoriented, seeing double, or vomiting inside their helmets from repeated blows. One English knight even described waking up in a tent, his armour stripped away, asking, "Did we win?" He'd been knocked cold at the first clash and never saw the rest of the fight. Sometimes armour didn't fail during battle, it failed because of battle. Picture this: you're hours into a siege, you've climbed a ladder, taken a hit to the hip, and you're still fighting atop a narrow wall. You lunge for an enemy, and your cuirass creaks ominously. A moment later, you feel something give. It's not your body, it's your armour. A strap has snapped, or a buckle torn loose. Your breastplate slips to one side. Your ribs are exposed. You press on, hoping no one notices, praying that your squire will find you before your luck runs out. Other times, armour failed before the first blow was struck. The night before a duel, you're checking your gear, and you find a crack in your greave, or a rust spot too deep to polish out, or worse, a joint that won't flex. Do you call off the duel? Forfeit? Admit that you didn't care for your armour well enough? Not likely. You step into the ring and gamble that no one will strike there. Sometimes you win. Sometimes you don't. Even in tournaments, where knights weren't supposed to kill each other, accidents happened. Lances pierced eye slits. Sabatons crushed fingers. One man in Burgundy died when his opponent's sword deflected off a pauldron and pierced the gap beneath his jaw. A single misplaced strike, and the illusion of safety vanished. Historians still argue whether these failures were rare or more common than records suggest. Some point to the expense and craftsmanship of late medieval armour as proof of its reliability. Others, citing letters and battlefield reports, insist that even the best suit had its flaws. Maybe it was both. Incredible protection, but never perfect. There's a particularly tragic letter from a young French knight who wrote to his mother after surviving his first campaign. "My harness bore true until the moment I most needed it," he wrote. "A mace found the gap in my elbow and I'm now unfit for the sword." He signed it with trembling script, his career, and likely his dominant arm, lost to one bad angle and one unlucky strike. So what did knights do when armour failed? They adapted. Some switched to lighter armour, favouring speed over bulk. Others carried backup weapons designed for close-in work, rondel daggers, short swords, hooks to exploit weaknesses in enemy armour. Many fought in groups, trusting that comrades would protect their blind spots, warn of dangers, or drag them to safety if something broke. But deep down they all knew the truth. Armour wasn't a guarantee, it was a gamble. A good one, most of the time, but not always. And yet, they kept wearing it. Because even flawed protection was better than none. Because armour gave you time. Time to dodge, to counter, to survive the first blow and maybe land the second. Because without it, you were just flesh and hope. With it, you were a knight. And perhaps that's the most honest part of all. Knights didn't believe their armour was invincible. They knew it could fail. Because they understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, or the absence of risk. It was marching forward in full knowledge that your armour might crack, your sword might miss, and your enemy might not. So next time you see a gleaming suit of plate in a museum, don't just admire its polish. Look closer. See the scratches, the hammer marks, the tiny welded repairs. Each flaw is a story. Each imperfection is a memory of a time when armour didn't work, and someone lived to tell the tale anyway. In the end, armour was never just steel. It was faith. In the armourer, in yourself, in fate. You buckled it on not because it made you untouchable, but because it gave you one more chance to fight again. And that, more than anything, made it worth wearing, even when it broke. It's strange, the things people remember. They don't always recall the names of kings or the outcomes of battles, but they remember legends. And one of the strongest, most persistent myths in the collective imagination is the idea that medieval knights were walking tanks. Invulnerable, all-powerful, and nearly impossible to kill. Movies show them mowing down enemies by the dozen, swords bouncing harmlessly off their shining shells. Tour guides tell stories about armour so heavy the wearer had to be hoisted onto a horse with a crane. Kids imagine a knight in full plate as the ultimate warrior, more machine than man. And yet, most of it isn't true. Welcome to the world of medieval myths and misunderstandings, where armour, already heavy and hot, also bears the weight of centuries of exaggeration. Some of these stories are harmless embellishments, but others deeply distort the reality of what it meant to fight and survive in steel. And you, tired and bruised from a long campaign, probably wouldn't recognise yourself in the tales that have been told about you ever since. Let's start with the most enduring myth of all, that knights in full plate armour were so heavy they could barely move. This story has survived for centuries. You hear it from documentaries, see it in comedy sketches, read it in pop history books. The knight is immobile brute, unable to get up if he falls, flailing on his back like a stranded beetle. But here's the mainstream historical fact. It's wrong. A full suit of plate armour from the 15th century weighed about 45 to 65 pounds, 20 to 30 kilograms, roughly the same as the gear carried by modern infantry soldiers. And that weight wasn't all hanging from the shoulders. It was distributed across the body, legs, arms, chest and back. Properly fitted armour, made by a skilled armourer, allowed surprisingly good movement. You could run, jump, even climb stairs or mount a horse, without needing a crane. Modern reenactors and researchers have put this to the test. In full plate, they've completed obstacle courses, engaged in sword fights, performed somersaults, and even jogged for miles. Was it exhausting? Absolutely. Was it limiting? Of course. But it wasn't paralysing. A knight who couldn't move would have been dead before lunch. Another favourite myth. That knights wore armour all the time, even while eating, sleeping or riding from village to village. The truth? No sane person wore armour unless they had to. It was too uncomfortable, too impractical, and too valuable to risk in everyday situations. You wore a padded gambeson or a comfortable tunic while marching or relaxing. Armour was for battle or training, and sometimes for show. Tournaments and ceremonies might require full dress, but otherwise a knight kept his steel locked away until needed. And then there's the legend of the indestructible suit, armour so tough that nothing could penetrate it. But armour had weak points, by design. Eye slits, armpits, joints, the back of the knees, the groin. No amount of steel could cover everything without turning you into a statue. That's why skilled fighters learned to exploit these openings with thrusts and targeted blows. Even a dagger could end a knight if placed correctly. One quirky detail from the 15th century: fencing manuals like Fiore dei Libris, Fior di Battaglia, the flower of battle, didn't focus on wild sword swings. They taught techniques for grappling, half-swording, holding the blade halfway down to aim more precisely, and even throwing an opponent to the ground to stab through the armour's gaps. These were not duels of attrition. They were calculated, technical affairs, fought with brutal efficiency. Then there's the idea that armour always looked like it does in museums, pristine, polished, and dazzling. But much of that shine is modern restoration. On campaign, your armour was often scratched, dented, smudged with ash, smeared with mud, or streaked with dried blood. You might spend hours polishing it before a parade or feast, but after a day of riding or fighting, it looked and smelled like work. The helmet especially gets mythologized. People assume it was always worn closed, like a medieval motorcycle helmet. In truth, knights often kept their visors open until the moment of danger. Breathing, seeing, and communicating were impossible with a visor down, and no one wanted to be surprised with a sneeze while trying to lead troops. Visors stayed up until the archers loosed their first volley. Another common misconception? That armour was standardised, every knight, the same silhouette. But the reality was wonderfully diverse. Armour varied wildly by region, period, and personal taste. German Gothic armour had fluted ridges and tight articulation. Italian armour was smooth, rounded, and fashionable. English plate often mixed styles. Wealthy knights customised their suits with crests, etchings, paint, and exotic materials. You might see a lion engraved on a breastplate, or a visor shaped like a snarling dog. One famous Italian helmet was designed to look like the knight was smiling, grinning death in the face. The most ironic myth? That armour made you invincible, that it was proof of strength and dominance. But many knights felt vulnerable inside it. They knew its limits, knew it might jam, overheat, or split under pressure. That's why some knights wore charms, carried relics, or muttered prayers before battle. The steel was just part of the defence. The rest came from faith, skill, and luck. Some even rejected armour altogether. During the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a few elite soldiers experimented with lighter armour, or even no armour at all, relying on agility and surprise instead. These were the predecessors of the skirmishers and scouts that later armies would use more formally. Not everyone wanted to be a walking bell. The myths extended to battle tactics too. You might imagine knights charging in like berserkers, roaring their names and swinging wildly. But most real engagements began with caution, positioning, and careful observation. Commanders used hand signals, drums, horns. Knights often fought in pairs or small teams, protecting each other's flanks, rotating positions when someone tired. It wasn't a Hollywood melee, it was a terrifying game of stamina, awareness, and technique. And then there's the modern image of a knight always fighting on horseback. True, cavalry charges were powerful, but knights also dismounted regularly, especially when terrain made riding impossible, or when defending fortifications. Some of the most famous knights in history preferred to fight on foot, using their mobility, and reach more effectively without the constraints of stirrups and reins. Another persistent myth, that knights were always male. But the historical record offers glimpses of women who wore armour, led troops, and fought. Joan of Arc is the most famous, but there were others, like Jeanne de Clisson, who took to piracy in the 14th century, or Matilda of Tuscany, who commanded armies in the 11th. Female warriors were rare, yes, but not non-existent, and when they did wear armour, they faced all the same hardships as their male counterparts, plus a few more. Historians still argue about how these myths took root. Some blame Victorian Romanticism, 19th century artists painting knights as chivalrous heroes, always gleaming, never sweating. Others blame Renaissance poets and playwrights, who needed their heroes larger than life. Still others think the myths were spread deliberately, part of medieval propaganda. After all, a knight who seemed superhuman might scare enemies more effectively than one who limped and grunted in the mud. There's also the legacy of tournament armour, which was heavier and less practical than battlefield gear. Designed for sport and safety, some tournament suits were incredibly bulky and not meant for real combat. But when these suits ended up in museums, they helped cement the false image of immobility and excess. Then came Hollywood. Filmmakers needed visual shorthand, so they gave every knight the same suit, the same swagger, and the same implausible powers. Audiences ate it up. By the time pop culture got through with it, the knight had become less a person and more a symbol, a steel golem clanking toward righteousness. But you know better. You've lived in this skin. You've walked in this armour. You know how the gauntlets pinch, how the visor fogs up, how the sweat soaks through your gambeson. You've felt the bruises from a blow that didn't even break your armour, the burning lungs after a climb in full plate, the sting of shame when a rust spot you missed spreads under your squire's watchful eye. You also know the pride that comes from strapping it on, the way people look at you differently, the way a breastplate feels when it catches the light, the moment just before battle when your helmet closes and your world becomes steel and breath and purpose. So let the myths swirl, let the tales grow taller in every telling. You don't need them. You don't need to be a legend. You've got the real thing, the weight, the scars, the truth. And it's heavier than any story. The sun is sinking low. Your limbs tremble beneath the familiar weight of your armour. Your eyes sting from dried sweat, and your legs, those dutiful pillars of iron and flesh, threaten to give way. The battle is long over. Victory, perhaps, or retreat. Either way, it doesn't matter now, because all you can think about, more than hunger, more than wounds, more than glory, is getting out of this steel shell. Shedding armour after battle is one of those strange, intimate moments that history rarely records. The chroniclers write of valour and strategy, of kings and banners. They don't tell you what it feels like to finally unbuckle your breastplate, to peel off your damp gambeson, to stand bare-shouldered in the dusk, ribs heaving, sweat pooling at your feet like water drawn from a well. But in that moment, you understand something fundamental, something raw and human. The armour was protection, it was strength, but it was also a prison, and being free of it is nothing short of euphoric. It begins slowly. Your squire approaches, quiet, hesitant. You're both too tired for words. He starts with the gauntlets, carefully loosening the straps, easing the steel from your aching fingers. They clink as he places them on a cloth. Then come the vambraces and rear braces, your forearms and biceps released from their iron casing. You flex your arms. They burn. Every movement feels strange, too light, too fast, like your body has forgotten how to move without delay. You try to stand still, but the tremors are there, tiny quakes that ripple through your thighs and calves as the cuisses and greaves are removed. When your sabatons, the armoured boots, finally come off, your feet almost weep. Damp, swollen, calloused, blistered, you wiggle your toes and it feels like a rebirth. Your torso is last. The breastplate, now streaked with dirt and nicked from a dozen glancing blows, comes free with a hollow clunk. You take your first deep breath, unimpeded. The cold air hits your chest. Your shirt is soaked through. The gambeson underneath is stained, blackened at the shoulders, torn slightly at one seam. But you don't care. You're out. And for the first time all day your spine straightens, your muscles expand, your armourless skin meets the air. It's a full-body sigh. There's a mainstream historical truth behind this ritual. Shedding armour was a process of both relief and vulnerability. Knights, men-at-arms, and even kings required assistance to do it properly. Squires were trained not just in battle logistics, but in the sacred post-battle process of disarmament. Armour was heavy, yes, but it was also complicated. Dozens of buckles, laces, and overlapping plates. Removing it too quickly or carelessly could cause injury or damage the suit itself. But beneath the technical skill was something deeper, a kind of reverence, because to remove a knight's armour after battle was to see them not as a symbol, but as a person, flushed, shaking, exhausted, real. In that moment, the myth was peeled away alongside the plates, and what waited beneath? Bruises, always bruises. Even when the armour held, the force of the blows left its mark. Purples and greens bloomed along shoulders, ribs, thighs, fingers swollen from impact, knees scraped where the mail rubbed raw. Sometimes small cuts opened between the gaps, minor at first but dangerous if left untreated. Infection started small, a welt that never healed, a gash that turned hot. Armour protected you from swords. It couldn't save you from rot. That's why the next step after disarming was care. The squire fetched clean cloth, wine or vinegar and herbs. You sat on a stool, perhaps by firelight, as your wounds were cleaned. You winced, you joked, you bit down on leather. If you were lucky, a trained physician was nearby. If not, your squire did his best, whispering apologies for every clumsy touch. The cleaning was physical, but also psychological. In those moments, you could finally process the day. You could ask what happened, where your comrades were, how many survived, who had fallen. You could cry if you needed. No one would fault you. Men wept after battle all the time, though they didn't always admit it. Historians still debate the emotional toll of battle on armoured knights. Some argue that their training and upbringing shielded them from fear or trauma. Others point to letters and confessions filled with dread, nightmares, and guilt. The truth is likely both. Knights were tough, but not unfeeling. Their armour did not insulate them from grief. In fact, many knights described the moment of removing armour as the first time they felt human again. One 15th century Italian chronicler writes of a knight who, after a long siege, removed his helm, looked up at the stars and began to pray, for he had not seen the sky in a week. Another told of men who knelt in the mud after battle, pressing their bare hands to the earth just to feel something living. There's a quirky tidbit from a Burgundian military camp. A knight kept a habit of removing his helmet and immediately dunking his head in a barrel of water, swearing it was the only way to scrub the noise out. Others took to kissing the crucifix around their neck, tucked all day beneath the layers, as soon as their breastplate came off. And then came the silence. Not complete, of course. The camp buzzed with messengers, wounded men groaning, horses being fed, but a new kind of quiet, inside your own mind. The clamour of combat faded. The ringing in your ears dulled. You were no longer watching every shadow, no longer gripping your weapon until your knuckles turned white. The danger had passed, and with it, the need to be steel. You drank water, real water, not the stale broth in your skin. You might sip wine if you had any, just enough to calm the tremors. You ate something bland but warm, bread, stew, the kind of food you didn't taste so much as absorb. Some men fell asleep mid-bite. Others stared into the fire, armour cooling behind them, body cooling beneath the bandages. Your squire cleaned your armour that night as you rested. You could hear the familiar scrape of cloth against steel. He might curse at the rust, or whistle an old song. He'd tighten loose rivets, replace broken straps, oil the hinges. He'd hang your padding up to dry and lay your helmet beside your bed just in case. You'd already be asleep by then. Or maybe not. Because there was still something else. Something that came only after the armour was off, after the fire burned low, after the wounds were cleaned. The memories. You remembered how close the blade came, the sound of someone dying, the way your opponent's eyes looked, wild or pleading, the sting of failure, the rush of survival. These thoughts came silently, pressing against your mind like rain on a tent canvas. Some you pushed away, others you welcomed, because no matter how many times you'd worn armour, no matter how many fights you'd seen, it never felt routine. Not really. In some households, knights lit a candle after battle, not for the dead, but for themselves. To mark that they'd made it back, to give thanks. Others slept with relics or charms under their pillow, and still others, stoic to the end, lay back, closed their eyes and let exhaustion do its work. In that vulnerable, stripped-down state, you were reminded of what the armour was truly for. Not just for show, not just for glory, but for survival. Every dent was proof you'd made it. Every scar. A medal without ceremony. Sometimes the armour didn't come off, not right away. Maybe the camp was unsafe. Maybe the attack wasn't over. In those cases, you slept in your gear, head against a saddle, sword still strapped to your belt, dreaming fitfully in layers of steel and sweat. Those nights were the worst. You woke stiff, sore, half-choked by your own breath. But you woke, and that was enough. Eventually, though, the time came. You rolled your shoulders, you stretched your limbs, you stepped out into the morning, lighter now, softer. The world looked sharper, trees greener, wind cooler. The weight was gone, and with it the burden. You knew it would return, tomorrow maybe, but for now you were free. Some nights sang after battle, not war songs but quiet ones, lullabies from childhood, prayers set to music, tunes their mothers used to hum. These weren't songs for others, they were songs for the soul. A knight was never just a soldier, he was a contradiction, tough but bruised, proud but tired, armoured but breakable. And in the hours after the armour came off, when the silence returned and the sky turned grey, he became something else entirely. Human. No sword, no crest, no gleam. Just breathe, just skin, just survival. And so, as your squire folds the cloth over your greaves and banks the fire, you close your eyes. You remember the heat, the weight, the noise. But now there is none of that. Now there is only quiet, and it is enough. And now, as the last embers glow in the hearth and the weight of memory softens into silence, you settle deeper into stillness. The armour is gone. The sounds of battle have long faded, and your limbs, once heavy with steel, now rest quiet beneath blankets. No clatter, no command, no edge of danger creeping near. Just the hush of night. You survived it. The burden, the bruises, the boiling heat and bitter cold. The endless buckles, the aching spine, the moments when breath itself felt too hard to find. You wore the iron skin and bore its price. But now you're here, in this quiet hour, unburdened. The wind moves gently across your skin now, like the softest memory. It carries no scent of war, only the distant promise of morning. You feel your muscles loosen, inch by inch, like laces undone. Even your thoughts begin to melt, blades turn to shadows, worries to dust. You're not steel anymore, you're warmth and breath and rest. Let the echoes fade, let the light dim. There is no need to hold yourself up any longer. You are safe, you are home, and you are finally free to sleep. Sweet dreams.